Getting back to your family's kind of work and labor background, you descend from coal miners, right?
Yeah, just like in one little branch, right? Mom's mom grew up in a coal mining country. My mom always said she hated seeing like going to visit her grandparents because they had an outhouse and she did not like that. My grandma had gotten married and then got divorced because she was extremely mentally ill and very, very difficult to live with. But it was a coal mining community in, the early 20th century, and nobody really knew what mental illness was, and they were drunk all the time. So it never got diagnosed, never got treated. She has a divorce, and that was very, very stigmatized at the time. So once you get divorced, you cannot come home. So she wound up at, around World War II, marrying a nuclear chemist and just skipping town entirely. My mom grows up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, while grandpa's making the Manhattan Project, or working with the Manhattan Project. So it's kind of an interesting, on one side, you're total white trash, and on the other side, there's like some high-end science going on. So it was a really interesting upbringing. Yeah, so class and science is what we do.
That's interesting because a similar kind of situation with my own grandparents. My grandmother was actually adopted by relatively wealthy Charlestonians, and she had a decent life and actually ended up going to college, and which was very rare for women those days. But my grandfather was extremely poor. He came from just a poor farming family in South Georgia where, nothing much was growing down there at the time. His father had gone up and down working in the auto factories in Detroit, of course, right after the Great Depression. And so they were going back and forth from Detroit to South Georgia. And the only way my grandfather had the chance to go to college, which is where he met my grandmother, was because through the GI Bill. Fought at the tail end of World War II and got to go to college through a governmental program. And so many poor men, poor white men in the South, were lifted out of poverty through that one governmental program of allowing them a college education.
That's really interesting. On the other side of my family, my grandfather on the other side, my dad's dad, I'm not sure exactly what his situation was. I think his dad was just a hobo, right? But he was so poor that he got taken by an orphan train. It was a transitional phase between orphanages and foster homes, and also sometimes just straight up human trafficking, because folks in California wanted farm labor, and they wanted that farm labor to not be able to vote. That's very important. That's a kind of a constant trend. But they also didn't want any Black or Japanese or Mexican people in their communities. So how are we going to do this? Well, there's all these orphans on the street. Let's go just knock some of those out to California. So he was picked up in Valparaiso, Indiana. I don't know if his parents were actually dead or not at this point. Family history's been very murky on that. But he gets taken out to California. From all accounts, his adoption situation was pretty congenial. He was adopted actually by a couple school teachers, and they were just trying to do the right thing and adopt this kid. He wasn't put to work as a farm laborer or anything, but he was so traumatized by that experience of being moved cross country as a very young child with no adults. We're still dealing with that trauma as a family 2-3 generations later. And so you look at how much other people in the US have been trafficked, like entire communities. This is just my grandpa. He didn't have to learn a new language, didn't get beat for speaking his own, didn't have to cut his hair, change his culture, anything like that. But that was the experience of so many Native and Black children in the US until a lot more recently than you would think. Mm-hmm. And so when that's happening to entire groups of people, that level of trauma to some extent is something that I can kind of relate to, and we just got a tiny slice of that. It was just one person, it wasn't entire communities. Just the way the poor are kind of treated like a natural resource.
Right, and poor children, like she said, I mean, this is not an uncommon thing, especially throughout the 19th century and even into the early 20th century. Bound out child labor. They're essentially indentured servants in some ways until they're of age. They're bound out to people and made to work. They're called de facto, they're de facto masters. They're called masters. In most cases, they're legally able to physically beat these children and have them work in labor for them, and just providing the bare minimum sustenance.
Right, and I think that really kind of gets to the heart of why this is something that I feel like other Anglo-Americans should be interested in, is white supremacy is a problem, because you wouldn't have had trafficking of white children if you hadn't had a whole lot of trafficking of other kids first. If we accept a social situation where it's okay to just yank kids from their family and move them around at will, then it's okay to do it to just about everybody. So I feel like obviously you should be against it for, when people of color are being trafficked, don't just be against it because, oh, maybe that'll happen to me and I don't like that. I'm okay with it happening to them. But just understand that if we have laws that allow that, it's not just going to stay with certain people.
So that brings us to a really interesting point, something that brings a lot of the different things that we've been talking about over these last few segments all together. And that's the fact that all throughout history in America, many times poor and working class white people, their interests are actually tied to people of color, tied to the very people that they hate and they're taught to hate, right? Taught to hate by the elite whites, by the people in power, by the people who own the land, the resources, the capital, and everything. And we have to start seeing white supremacy as something that's engendered. Elite whites are funneling this. They are fueling the flames of it. They are stoking racism wherever they can because they know if they keep poor whites and all other races of laborers apart from each other, there will never be a true powerful working class in the US, at least not for the next 20 or 30 years, right? There will never be a working class that can accomplish anything against odds that are so overwhelmingly stacked against them because of the wealth and power and influence that this tiny group, this tiny minority of white people hold in the US.
And it's really interesting because if you watch anything that people did as they were colonizing other countries, it was always play all these people against each other, and that's how they took over. They could never conquer that whole country if it were united, and so they would always start by playing people off each other. And it's really painful to see that happen to just working and middle class people, going along with that messaging about how we're not supposed to work together and how we're not supposed to like each other. And it's been going on for so long that it's hard to cross those aisles now because we have all these habits. We're like, like I don't, people speak in different ways and they act in different ways. And it's hard to figure out sometimes how to bridge those divides because we're trained to fear that. But I mean, that's really the only option, right? And there's such worse things than learning how to talk to other people, like suffering. So it's just, I don't know, it's really urgent to me to kind of put that pride aside and just kind of remember that we are all in this together. And even though it's awkward and weird and uncomfortable, I feel like a lot of folks kind of think trying to build coalitions is driven by guilt and like, oh, you have white guilt and you hate yourself. Honestly, I'm so much less afraid of the world now than I was back when I was like really conservative and buying into that fear about how these people are out to get you because we actually are all in this together.
So, as we've seen throughout the history of America and throughout the South, there have been moments where biracial coalitions, multiracial coalitions of working class people have come together, where chance for real change has been possible. But every single time it's been thwarted by the elite whites in power. And in reconceptualizing white supremacy, power, class, racism, we'd love to hear your comments. So please comment below, let us know what you're thinking. Hit subscribe and keep listening. Dr. Sarah Tabor, thank you so much as always. Remember to listen to Farm to Tabor podcast and look for her book forthcoming. And check out Masterless Men and find me on Twitter at Carrie Lee Merritt. Talk to you soon.